students, it's Professor Bridget. Welcome to Chapter 9. Chapter 9 discusses skeletal muscle and also the different types of muscle tissue. So we're going to first look at the histology of all three muscle types, and then we're going to learn more in-depth details about skeletal muscle. So for the next 2 weeks, we're not only going to be studying the lecture material for muscle, more specifically skeletal muscle, but also you're going to be using the models and the pictures and your complete anatomy app to identify the muscles and some other features of the muscles. Now, what we learned in the first few weeks of class was a lot about connective tissue. We learned about bones, and we learned about markings on bones. We're going to build on that knowledge now. When we're learning about muscles, we're going to learn where muscles attach, and they attach to bone. And where on bone do they attach? They attach to those bone markings that you spent so much time learning about in the first few weeks of class. So while you don't get tested cumulatively in anatomy, your knowledge is going to have to accumulate. So we're going to build on our previous knowledge now. And one of the things I've mentioned to you guys in previous lectures, but also in office hours, is one of the things that's really useful is to learn and be able to draw out concept maps. Concept maps look something like this, where you have a main idea or a main subject in the center, and then each arrow leads you to some other subtopic or information. And really what these concept maps do is give you a visual representation of all the information that you need to know, but in like one shot, one snapshot. Now, of course, there isn't every single bit of information, but a concept map is going to give you the basics, and it really helps you to organize information in your brain. So I've included this concept map in the lecture video, but I'll also send this out for you on Canvas so that you have it, so you don't have to recreate this, although I would like to see you guys begin creating your own concept maps, because that's part of the learning process. I'll send this out on Canvas so you have it. So today we're learning, as I said, about the muscular system, and primarily we're going to focus on skeletal muscle. But there's also smooth muscle and cardiac muscle. And remember the tissues we've learned about so far. We've learned about connective tissue. We'll just abbreviate that. We've learned about epithelial tissue. And we are learning about muscular or muscle tissue now. And then the very last one that we'll learn about in the next week is neural tissue. And there we have it, the 4 different tissue types that we find in the human body, right? So we're almost through all of the tissues, learning about the basics of the tissue types. So that's what we're going to cover in the first part of the lecture, and then we'll focus more specifically on skeletal muscle tissue. Later on in the semester, we will come back to cardiac muscle and smooth muscle, but the majority of our unit right now, or not the unit, the majority of your next 2 weeks is going to focus just on that skeletal muscle. Okay? Oops. So give me a second to kind of erase this all here. Okay, if at any time you guys have questions about concept maps, creating them, or how to read them, please let me know. You can always come back to this concept map whenever you're studying muscle tissue, just to reorganize your thoughts. So just as an introduction, you're probably familiar with what muscle does, just in general. Like, muscle gets you from one place to the next. It allows you to do all kinds of different actions, pick up a glass, stand up straight, lay down. And those are all voluntary actions. But if you think about it, humans are relying on muscles for almost all of the things that happen in your body, all of the physiological processes that happen in your body, whether you realize it or not. Without muscle, we would not be able to live. Not just without skeletal muscle, the muscle you can control, but think about cardiac muscle. That's the muscle that makes up your heart, right? You certainly couldn't live without that functioning properly. And then smooth muscle. Smooth muscle is muscle you can't control. It contracts on its own, and it does things like help you swallow, or help you go to the bathroom, or help move your dinner from the stomach to the intestines. It helps to, in effect, keep you warm or keep you cool. So humans rely on muscles for almost all of your physiological functions and interactions with the environment. So all of these muscles are equally important, even though what we're mostly going to focus on later is just skeletal muscle tissue. So let's go ahead and look at some of the things that all muscle tissue have in common, regardless of whether it's cardiac muscle or skeletal muscle or smooth muscle. All muscle has 4 things in common, 4 basic properties. They're all excitable, meaning they're going to respond to some sort of stimulation. Some muscle needs to be told to contract by the nervous system. Some muscle, like cardiac and smooth muscle, can respond to the nervous system, but also to circulating hormones. So it depends on the response that's required. Okay? So something has to tell muscle to contract. It doesn't contract on its own without some sort of stimulation. That muscle has to be excited. So this property is called excitability. All muscle, what it essentially does is contracts. So when that muscle is excited, the muscle gets shorter. And this is what we call contractility. So muscles have the ability to shorten, and when they do, they pull or create a tension on some other structure, usually connective tissue, either connective tissue or bone, right? That causes some sort of movement, some sort of response. Another thing that all muscle has in common is extensibility. So extensibility means that muscles have the ability to continue to contract over a range of resting lengths. So this means that if you were to lie your arm out straight, completely straight at the elbow, you have the ability to bend maybe 10 degrees and then extend again, or you can bend 10 degrees, stay there for a minute, and then bend so that there's a 90-degree angle at your elbow. Or you can go even further, and maybe there's just a 45-degree angle there. But you don't have to, for instance, go directly from a fully extended or straight elbow all the way to fully flexed. You have the ability to extend over a range of resting lengths. The muscle itself doesn't have to contract and then go back to complete resting length in order to contract again. So that's extensibility. And then elasticity is the ability of a muscle to go back to its original length after contraction. So think of it kind of like as an accordion. So if you were to think of an accordion, how you would push the 2 sides together and the accordion gets shorter, that would be muscle contraction. And then rebounding to its original length after that contraction would be like pulling the 2 ends of the accordion further apart from one another. So as muscles contract, when they contract, they don't stay contracted. They have the ability to completely relax and go back to their original resting length. So whether it's cardiac muscle or smooth muscle or skeletal muscle, all muscle has the ability or has what we call elasticity. So the first things we're going to do the first thing we're going to do is look at the histology of muscle. And we're going to learn about smooth muscle first. We'll look at structure, function, and location, and then any other characteristics about that muscle. So, smooth muscle acts involuntarily, meaning that you cannot make a conscious decision to contract smooth muscle like you can skeletal muscle. So, for instance, you have smooth muscle that causes contractions of the wall of the stomach. You cannot decide when that does not occur. You don't have control over that muscle. Also, these cells have the ability, those smooth muscle cells, have the ability to undergo mitosis very easily. Mostly because they're constantly being used. So they get worn out or they get damaged and they need to repair. So this isn't always the case with skeletal and cardiac muscle. So this is unique to smooth muscle, that these smooth muscles, the smooth muscle cells undergo mitosis regularly. Now the structure of smooth muscle cells compared to the other muscle cells that we're going to learn about, they're pretty small and they're thin and they're what we call spindle shaped. So they are kind of bulbous or fat in the center and then they taper off at the ends. That's what we refer to as being spindle shaped. So this is one individual smooth muscle cell. They are uninucleate, meaning they just have one nucleus. They do not have striations within them, like we'll see in the other two types. And they're connected to one another via gap junctions. If you recall, gap junctions are meant to, or they're large channels between cells that allow for passage of ions between cells. And so this allows for communication between cells. So let's say, for instance, there was another cell. I won't draw the cell, but let's say, for instance, there's another cell to the left of this cell. And we would like maybe sodium and calcium and magnesium to cross from one cell to the next. These are wide open channels that allow those ions to pass from one cell to the next. That's what gap junctions are. The function of a smooth muscle is to push fluids, and I would even say semi-solids, depending on where on the body you're talking about. So smooth muscle generally is going to line the walls of all of your hollow organs, your esophagus, your stomach, your small intestine, the large intestine, your blood vessels, structures that carry urine out of the body, the bladder, the uterus. Almost all of your internal hollow organs and body tubes are lined in smooth muscle. And the smooth muscle there is pushing something somewhere. So if you think about food, for instance, leaving the stomach and making its way into the small intestines. Depending on what you've eaten, that may not be a complete fluid. We could say that that's a semi-solid, right? The food's going to leave your stomach and get pushed by smooth muscle into the small intestines. If you think about the uterus, for example, carrying a fetus, during childbirth, the smooth muscle of the uterus contracts to expel the fetus. And so in that case, that would be a solid object. That's an exception, right? That's generally what smooth muscle does. It's pushing fluids or semi-solids or something from one place to the next. And then, of course, the locations are as you see written here. So I've got the picture on the top that shows you the general structure of one individual smooth muscle cell. But the reason I have that there is because in the picture of the histology below that, it's really difficult to see the individual shapes of the cells. So I can just kind of outline one right here, right? So these purple structures are the nuclei, but it's really difficult to see the cell membrane when you've got so many cells packed together here. But one thing I want you to recognize is the smooth appearance of the tissue. There are no striations like you're going to see in the next two types of muscle that we learn about. Okay, then we can move on to cardiac muscle, and the picture will be on the next slide. cardiac muscle makes up the wall of your heart, and that cardiac muscle acts involuntarily. So from about 6 weeks of fetal development all the way up until the moments that you pass away, these cells are continually contracting, and these cells do not readily divide. They do not readily undergo mitosis. And so essentially the cardiac muscle cells that you have when you're born are essentially the same ones that you have when you die. So this is why it's really important to take good care of your heart lifestyle-wise, because when those cardiac muscle cells become damaged or die, you're essentially unable to make more. There are some exceptions. I won't go over them with you, but in general, we say cardiac muscle cells don't have the ability to grow and divide. The cell structure they're small. They're not as small as smooth muscle cells. They are striated, so you'll visibly see some stripes inside the cells, and they're thin and branched. They connect to one another at the ends by what we call intercalated discs. I'll show you this. And they also connect via what we call gap junctions, right? And desmosomes. So in a second, I'll just show you now. Okay, so this would be cardiac muscle tissue. And if I were to draw just one cardiac muscle cell, and this is going to be a bad drawing, of course, you guys know how bad I am at drawing, but cardiac muscle cells kind of have this branching shape. Sometimes they'll have like 2 or 3 nuclei, like this. And then they're going to be connected to one another. I'll draw a different cell in a different color. Here's another cardiac muscle cell. And they're going to be connected to one another via these reinforcing proteins that we call intercalated discs. So you have, right where those cells are connected, you have this thickening. And you can really see that here. These lines right here, all of those are intercalated discs. So that tells you where two cardiac muscle cells are anchored to one another. Also, what you see, I'll try and zoom in here, are these tiger stripes. See those? You do not have those in smooth muscle. So these are the striations I was talking about. So that's one of the characteristics of cardiac muscle. But the main identifying feature of cardiac muscle tissue will be those intercalated discs that you see there. Okay? Smooth muscle does not have intercalated discs, and neither does skeletal muscle. So you might want to make yourself a little chart comparing and contrasting skeletal muscle, smooth muscle, and cardiac muscle. And now we're going to focus on skeletal muscle. So everything we do for this chapter and for the next 2 weeks in lab, with the exception of histology, is we're going to be focusing on skeletal muscle. So skeletal muscles are the organs of the muscular system. And you have somewhere in your body, somewhere around 630 plus skeletal muscles in your body. Their structure is such that they're much larger than cardiac and smooth muscle cells, and they're long and cylindrical. So the length of them can be up to 30 centimeters. To put that into perspective, 30 centimeters is about 12 inches. So these individual cells can be up to 12 inches long. So that's significantly larger than cardiac and smooth muscle cells. So they're cylindrical in shape. They will have striations like you saw in cardiac muscle, but cardiac muscle cells were a different shape. And these skeletal muscle cells are going to be multinucleated. They're going to have multiple nuclei. And those nuclei are going to be located around the periphery, around the edges, kind of like ants on a log or insects crawling on a log. They're only crawling on the bark of the log. Functions of skeletal muscle are, yes, they produce voluntary and in some cases involuntary movement. They're helping you to maintain your posture and body position right now. They're allowing you to sit up straight and hold your head up straight. They are supporting your internal organs or protecting your internal organs. Think about the abdominal pelvic cavity. There are no bones protecting the anterior side of the abdominal pelvic cavity. There are your ribs that protect the organs in the thoracic cavity, but in the abdominal pelvic cavity, you've got 4 layers of abdominal muscles there that are going to protect those internal organs. Skeletal muscle also helps to regulate the entering and exiting of material into and out of the body. So at all your body openings, you're going to find skeletal muscle. So if you think about your mouth, for instance, there is skeletal muscle that's controlling the entrance of your mouth. If you think about the anus, for instance, there's a skeletal muscle there that is controlling exiting of material from the digestive tract. And probably one of the things that you might know, but you just probably don't think of in a scientific sense or in a biological sense, is that skeletal muscle is the primary reason we as humans are able to maintain 98.6 degrees. And the reason for that is this. You learned in a Gen Bio class somewhere along the way that this molecule, glucose, in the presence of oxygen, is broken down inside the mitochondria of your cells, and it produces really what we're after, which is ATP. That's the source of energy that your cells are able to use. But what's also produced is some CO2. That's what we exhale when we breathe out, right? We can't let CO2 build up in our body. And there's some water that's released too. That's why our breath is warm and wet. But more specifically, with regards to what I'm talking about, is heat. This process of cellular respiration generates a whole lot of heat. That process of converting glucose into ATP is only about 30% efficient, meaning only about 30% of the energy that was originally present in glucose actually becomes ATP. The rest of that energy in this molecule of glucose gets released as heat. So this is happening in all of your muscle cells, in all of the muscle tissue, in all of the organs in your body. And when this occurs, you're constantly releasing heat. And there are mechanisms in the body that help you to hold on to that heat and not release all of that heat to the environment. So when we can hold on to that heat, helps us to maintain 98.6 degrees. This is expensive. This is metabolically expensive if you think about it, but it works for humans. The benefits outweigh the cost. So one of the major functions of skeletal muscle is maintaining body temperature. We've all probably been there at some point where you are so cold that you start shivering. This is called shivering thermogenesis, shivering heat making. So this is where you're cold enough, where your autonomic nervous system takes over and causes these involuntary contractions of muscle. So this involuntary conversion of glucose into ATP to create a little bit of heat to warm you up. Okay, so that's probably not one of the first things that came to your mind as a function of skeletal muscle. We can look at skeletal muscle underneath the microscope, and you can really quickly see the differences here. I'll use this one down at the bottom. Here's one individual skeletal muscle cell, so you can see its shape. It's long and cylindrical. And then also, each one of these structures is a nucleus. And you can see those nuclei here and here. And the nuclei are going to be what we call peripherally located, meaning they're only around the outsides of the cell, around the periphery. Now you might be like, well, Bridget, that one looks like it's right smack dab in the center and it's not around the periphery. And that's just because of the view you're looking at. You're looking down on this cell. So the nucleus is actually on the surface, but you don't really have any depth perception. So this is a longitudinal view of skeletal muscle underneath a microscope. But if we were to look at skeletal muscle in cross-section, you see it very differently. And I know that we've lost some resolution converting this to a video, but you'll see this underneath the microscope in your virtual microscope, where, let's see, where's a good one? Here would be one individual muscle cell, right here, and you can see that the nuclei are located peripherally. Like you don't see a nucleus like right here, smack in the center of the cell, right? So that's one of the key characteristics of skeletal muscle too, is that one, it's multinucleated, many nuclei, and those nuclei are located peripherally. Okay, so we're going to kind of switch gears here, and now that we've completed the histology of muscle tissue, and we've looked at cardiac, smooth, and skeletal, now we're going to focus on skeletal muscle exclusively, and some of the terms that we use when we're talking about skeletal muscle. You'll see on Canvas that I've posted an Excel spreadsheet. That's called the OIA spreadsheet. O stands for origin, I stands for insertion, and A will be on the next slide. A stands for action. And these are things that we're going to have to know for this unit. We're going to have to know the origin of a muscle, the insertion of a muscle, and the action of a muscle. So the origin and the insertion are both points of attachment for the muscle to the bone, mostly to bone. So think along with me. What's the name of the structure that connects muscle to bone? It's a tendon. So the way in which muscle is attached to bone is via tendons. So the origin would be where the tendon of the muscle originates. The insertion is where the tendon of the muscle inserts. It's on another bone. So if we're thinking about origins and insertions, there are some rules about the origin and the insertion. The origin the origin of the tendon is going to be on the bone that remains still or stationary during the movement. This is a general rule. And the insertion is where the tendon of that muscle inserts on the bone that's moving when the muscle is contracting. So let's do this. Put your right hand out, or your right arm out straight at the elbow. Take your left hand and put it on your shoulder, on your scapula. I'm going to continue with an example of the biceps brachii. The biceps brachii is that muscle on the anterior side of your brachium. The action of the biceps brachii is to bend at the elbow, but we don't say bend, right? Because this is anatomy. We're going to say the action of the biceps brachii is to perform flexion at the elbow. Flexion is the same as bending, right? So if you've got your left hand on your right shoulder, your right arm is stretched out straight, what I want you to do is flex the forearm or flex at the elbow. Bend your elbow and pay special attention to which bones are moving. It's the radius and the ulna that are moving. So that's where the biceps brachii inserts, because that's the bone that's moving. The origin of the biceps brachii is on the scapula. So extend your arm again. Make sure your left arm is on your shoulder and bend at the elbow, flex at the elbow. You should not feel the scapula moving at all. That's the origin. The biceps brachii, the tendons of the biceps brachii originate on the scapula and insert on the radius and the ulna. So the point of origin is the scapula. The point of insertion is on the bones of the forearm. Another way to kind of remember this, or just kind of a general rule, is that the origin is proximal to the insertion. So the origin is closer to an attached base than the insertion. So we go back to the biceps brachii example. The scapula is the origin, and that scapula is proximal to the radius and the ulna, the insertion. Not all muscles are that easy to determine origin and insertion. Some muscles have they extend from a broad aponeurosis, so a big broad sheet of a tendon, and then you'll have the muscle in the middle, and then at the other end you have a narrow tendon. When you have that condition, the aponeurosis is usually the origin, and the narrow tendon is usually the insertion. In some cases, muscles will have 2 or more tendons at one end and only one at the other end. So in this case, the end of the muscle where there are several tendons, that would be considered the origin, and the other end of the muscle with just one single insertion, one single tendon, is going to be the insertion point. Make sure that you understand these, because you're going to be committing a lot of these origins and insertions to memory for your exam. So remember all of those bone markings, like the deltoid tuberosity. The deltoid tuberosity was that rough region on the proximal half of the humerus. That's one area where the deltoid muscle group inserts. It inserts on the deltoid tuberosity. So the reason we learned all of those bone markings before is because they're coming back now. Here, we're going to use them to understand origin and insertion of muscles. Now to the A in OAI. So we've already covered origin, we've covered what insertion means, and now we're going to cover the A, the action. There are 2 ways to describe a muscle's action. I don't mind which one you use. Use either one that works for you. You can reference the bone region that's affected. So in this case, the biceps brachii muscle performs flexion of the forearm being the bone region. But you could also say or reference the joint that's moving. So in the same example, the biceps brachii performs flexion of the elbow being the joint, right? I don't mind which one you use. Just use whatever is written in that Excel spreadsheet that I sent out to you guys. So those are muscle actions. Another way that we can group muscles according to their actions is into 3 ways. A muscle is either when an action is occurring, a muscle is doing one of a couple things. The muscle that's mostly responsible or chiefly responsible for producing a particular movement is called an agonist or a prime mover. So if we go back to the example of, again, lying your arm out flat, straight elbow. This is full extension at the elbow, right? If you were to flex or bend the elbow, do it up to about 90 degrees, the main muscle responsible for that, or the agonist of that movement, flexion at the elbow, is the biceps brachii. That's the main muscle responsible for that movement. That movement, that action, that is flexion at the forearm. When that biceps brachii is carrying out that movement, there are other muscles assisting the biceps brachii, and these are called synergists. And the muscles that are synergists aren't the ones that are primarily responsible for the action, that movement, but what they'll do is they'll contract during the movement to help stabilize the joint. So they're assisting the prime movers. And then lastly, there are antagonists. These are muscles whose actions are doing the opposite of the agonist. Not at the same time, but let's go back to the example of the biceps brachii. You know that biceps brachii performs flexion at the elbow. Which muscle or muscle group then is going to extend at the elbow or straighten the arm back out? That would be the triceps brachii. So when we're talking about actions, it's useful to know which muscle is primarily responsible for the action, which muscles are helping that prime mover or the agonist, and which muscles would be doing the opposite action. So if a muscle performs, if we're talking about a movement like flexion, that's the action. The antagonist would perform extension. If the prime mover or if we're talking about the action abduction, ABD, abduction, that's the movement, what would be the type of movement that is exactly the opposite of that? That would be adduction. Another example, if the action is elevation, what's the opposite or the antagonistic movement to elevation? Depression. So you're going to be responsible for recognizing which muscles are agonist, antagonistic pairs, like the biceps and the triceps are agonist, antagonistic pairs. They're doing opposite actions of one another. That's one example. Let me give you a different muscle agonist, antagonistic pair example. If you're standing up straight and you were to bend over, you were to fold yourself in half, just bend over, bend at the waist. That's flexion at the waist. The opposite action of flexion at the waist is extension at the waist. So when you flex at the waist, the abdominals are responsible for that. So in that case, the abdominals are the prime movers. The muscles that perform the exact opposite, extension at the waist, are the muscles of the lower back. We call these the erector spinae. So this would be an agonist-antagonistic pair. So when we're thinking about agonist-antagonistic pair, we have to first consider the action. The prime mover would be the muscle that's carrying out the action, and then the antagonist would be the muscle that does the opposite action. Okay, and last thing for part 1 of the muscle lecture is how muscles are named. Every muscle name tells a story. Muscles, it would be really nice if they were all named just using one single way, but that's not how it works. There are a few different ways in which muscles get their names. They are named for, in some cases, the specific body region. So the brachialis muscle, the root there is brachium. So you know where to find that. That's going to be in the near the brachium. A muscle that has femoris in its name, going to be located on the femur. A muscle that has tibialis as part of its name would be in the lower leg. A muscle that has radialis in its name, going to be near the radius. Sometimes muscles are named for their shape, like the trapezius muscle group. They kind of have this kite shape. There are the rhomboids, which kind of have a a rectangle kind of off to the side, a rhomboid shape. In some cases, muscles are named for the direction of the fibers or the individual skeletal muscle cells. How are they oriented to the long axis of the body? So again, you guys know how bad I am of an artist, but I'm going to do my best. We'll just take a yellow person here and draw in some muscle fibers. So muscles whose fibers go along with the long axis of the body, sometimes those muscles are referred to or have in their name the term rectus. Rectus means straight. In some cases, and this is a good example here in the abdominal region, when muscle fibers run at a 45-degree angle, they might have oblique in their name. And if they go perpendicular to the long axis of the body at a 90-degree angle, they might have transverse in their name. Sometimes muscles are named for specific or unusual features. So biceps. Bi means two, seps means heads. So in this case, a muscle whose partly named biceps has two origins, two tendons at one end. But there is also triceps, right? So that would mean that there are 3 points of origin. In some cases, and this would be the best way in my opinion, at least for students, muscles are named for their origin and their insertion. So one really good example is sterno. That means sternum, right? Cleido, if you recall from your Unit 1 homework, means clavicle. And mastoid refers to the mastoid process. And it's almost always like this, where the first part or the first 2 parts in the name of the muscle is the origin. So the sternocleidomastoid actually has 2 points of origin. One on the sternum, so one of the tendons originates on the sternum, and the other tendon originates on the clavicle. And then the muscle merges together and inserts on the mastoid process. Muscles tend to be named also based on their primary functions. So we can call them like flexors or extensors or abductors or adductors or levators or depressor. Think back to all of those actions that you learned occur at joints, or the movements that occur at joints. This example here that I'm giving you, flexor carpi radialis, this is a longer name of a muscle that has a lot of information. It tells you, one, that it does some sort of flexion. Carpi means wrist, and radialis refers to where you find it, the location. So this muscle runs down the length of the radius. So this name right here actually uses a few different ways that we've just discussed to name muscles. And that's usually the case. So extensor digitorum, or rectus femoris, or vastus lateralis, or biceps femoris, or triceps femoris. Usually you're going to see a combination of each of these methods used to identify or to name muscles. I encourage you to understand the names of muscles, not just to memorize them and not understand what the words mean, because when you understand what the words mean, there's a lot of information in the name of that muscle. So, like I mentioned earlier, on your test, you're going to have to know what some muscles' actions are. You're going to have to know what some muscles' origins are and insertions are. Sometimes those things can be found in the name itself, the name of the muscle itself. Sometimes the name of the muscle also refers to its action, like where it acts upon. So buccinator, or you could say buccinator, that acts on the cheek, right? That helps you to suck. This muscle allows you to pull the sides of your cheek in, like if you're doing fish kisses. Rarely, I shouldn't say rarely, more often than not, we're going to combine these ways to name muscles into one individual muscle name. So I highly encourage you to, while you're studying these muscles, if you don't know what one of the words in the name of the muscle means, look it up and it will help you to remember that muscle come test time. Okay, so that's it for part 1 of Muscle Chapter 9, the muscle lecture. Stay tuned. I'm going to record a part 2 for you.